I'm Marcel. I write the blog Lesser Known Gems, and today I'm here with Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin to celebrate LGBT month. What I'm going to talk about now is something that I thought about when reading it in an intersectionality perspective. Now, intersectionality perspective is a theory that developed in the 1980s that talks about how you can have more than one minority label or identity and how these interact with one another, which can be different than the individual minority label. Now, James Baldwin, as an African-American homosexual, does fit this label as someone who has more than one minority label. Now, reading the book in an intersectional perspective isn't anything new. Race has always been an issue when talking about this, because this book has an all-white cast written by a black author. This was a huge reaction from the black community and the black critics who talked about how James Baldwin was going through a black identity crisis. Because this also is about a man, a white man, who has to choose between his white girlfriend and his white boyfriend, and how he develops a same-sex relationship with this man. It became really sort of, how do we deal with this? So the book is about David, who is a white American living in Paris. His white American girlfriend is in Spain, thinking about whether or not she wants to marry David. And while she is in Spain, David gets involved with the gay community in Paris, and he is introduced to Giovanni, and due to financial issues, he moves in to Giovanni's room and becomes his roommate. And Giovanni's room becomes a literary representation of their not platonic relationship. But what's interesting about him writing about, James Baldwin writing about a pure white cast dealing with, and to simplify, I am only going to focus on LGB, because there is a difference between LGB and being a person of color in regarding to being a minority identity and a minority label. To simplify, you come out of the closet as someone who's queer. You don't come out of the closet the same way as a person of color. You have the ability, and I'm overlooking the ethics about being forced to be invisible and about the strains and trauma forced on people who don't want to be invisible. I'm just pointing out that you can be invisible regarding being queer in a way you can't if you are a person of color. And why this is interesting has to do with James Baldwin's use of effeminacy, so men acting feminine. And he describes this as almost purely a bad thing. And this is quite interesting. So, for example, the rich men within this homosexual community that take advantage of the poor boys are all described as very effeminate and fairies. And this could just be David's inner homophobia screaming out that I don't like this, because the book is told from his point of view. But Giovanni when he is in a bad place, is also described as being effeminate, and him being effeminate is a visual cue of him being in a bad place. And the fact that David feels that effeminacy is forced upon him within this relationship is something that he talks about and describes as something very negative. In the beginning, because the motives which led me to Giovanni's rooms were so mixed, had so little to do with his hopes and desires, and was so deeply a part of my own desperation, I invented in myself a kind of pleasure in playing the housewife after Giovanni had gone to work. I threw out the paper, the bottles, the fantastic accumulation of trash. I examined the content of the innumerable boxes and suitcases and disposed of them. But I am not a housewife. Men never can be housewives. And the pleasure was never real or deep. So David at this point doesn't have a job. So he's pretty much not doing anything. And because of that, he sort of ends up, as he points out, becoming a sort of housewife and cleaning and everything. And he considered that a sort of, culturally, that is a sort of a femininity. It becomes acting and gendering towards being female. And this already here is described as something that he doesn't really get pleasure. And later in the book, when he and Giovanni is about to have a big argument, this is one of the things that is brought up by David. What kind of love can the two men have together anyway? All this love you talk about, isn't it just that you want to be made to feel strong? You want to go out and be the laborer and bring home the money, and you want me to stay here and wash the dishes and cook the food and clean this miserable closet of a room and kiss you when you come in through the door and lie with you at night and be your little girl. That's what you want. That's what you mean, and that's all you mean when you say you love me. You say I want to kill you. What do you think you've been doing to me? I am not trying to make you a little girl. If I wanted a little girl, I would be with a little girl. Why aren't you? Isn't it just that you're afraid and you take me because you haven't got the guts to go after a woman, which is what you really want? He was pale. You are the one who keeps talking about what I want. But I have only been talking about who I want. But I am a man, I cried. A man! What do you think can happen between us? Now, in this, he actually points to something that is common even among queer relationships today. Unfortunately, the question, who is the man, is a very, very common question asked towards same-sex couples. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that despite we in the Western world pride ourselves on female rights, power and dominance is still linked towards masculinity. Someone has to be the one in charge and the one with power. Someone has to be the man in the relationship. And by default, someone ends up being the woman. And this comes then back to my original point about being visible and invisible. David, as a white homosexual, has had the possibility of hiding his minority identity his whole life until he becomes in a relationship with Giovanni, who, because Giovanni is described as being masculine, both in appearance, but also in the cultural aspects of what we think of with masculine and dominance, among other things, being the breadwinner, he is forced to put on this effeminate personality. Whether or not that is true or not, this is what he thinks he has to do. He's forced to become effeminate. He's forced to then wear his queerness on the outside. Because, again, whether or not this is the right thing to do, people who gender towards the opposite sex much more quickly becomes associated with being queer. When we see an effeminate male or a masculine female, we're much quicker to jump to the conclusion, oh, he or she is probably queer. Yeah, it's pretty much very strange, all of those things. But that's, again, sort of how he, as a white person who has always been ability to hide being a minority, is then not suddenly being allowed to hide this. And James Baldwin, using femininity the way he does in the book, takes away the ability to be invisible from his white protagonist, a privilege that James Baldwin, being black, has never had. Because being black, he has to wear being a minority on the outside, as everyone who is a person of color has to do. I started thinking about this not just because of the book, but also has to do with a personal story. Now, my mother works within media, and she has a very close colleague and friend called Numan. And Numan has gotten quite a big reputation in Norway because he is a Muslim and he is of Pakistani descent, and he has become quite a big journalist and TV personality. And a couple of weeks ago, I got a text from my mom. Numan is out of the closet. And as someone who has only known Numan as my mother's gay work husband, I was a bit confused. But what she meant was that while Numan had been out personally and is in his private life, he was now out professionally, becoming, as far as I know, the first openly gay Muslim TV personality of Pakistani descent, and has gotten reactions because of this, both positive and negative, unfortunately. And hi, Numan, I know you're watching because I know my mother is going to make you watch this, and I'm sorry, I hope it has been too boring, but I wanted to read you something that James Baldwin has said regarding his own book. So to you and everyone who is denied being invisible, no matter if that should be a choice or not, this is for you. Since its publication, the novel has become a foundation text for gay culture. But the appeal of Giovanni's Room is decidedly broader than this. Baldwin understood this, even as those around him faltered in their support, insisting that publication would wreck his career. Quote, "They said I was a Negro writer, and I would reach a very special audience. And I would be dead if I alienated that audience. That in effect, nobody would accept that book coming from me. My agent told me to burn it." And one of the amazing things now about this book isn't just about the position it has within gay literature, but how it's being praised as African American literature and being held up as one of the staples and big contributions the African Americans have had to American culture. Leave your comments down below, and remember, it's better to be a witty fool than a foolish wit.